Professor Begg, with our condolences to those who lost their lives and beloved ones in the van incident. What do you make of the nature of this attack, first of all, and how much pressure will that further add to the May administration right now?
Well, Theresa May is in trouble overall. In the words of one of her former cabinet colleagues who she fired a year ago, she's a dead woman walking. I think that all these attacks and difficulties in the UK domestic politics are quite separate from the Brexit negotiations. They're not going to influence it. What will influence it is the result of Theresa May having a very weak grip on power now as a result of her failure during the general election, and the strong probability that within a few months she'll be gone.
Mr. Lochocki, observing from where you are in Paris, Prime Minister May, described by Professor Begg as dead woman walking, and yet today she condemned the so-called sickening attack against the Muslims in the UK as a result of this van incident. How stable is her government as a result? Probably even less than it used to be.
It's difficult to tell, speaking from Paris. However, I would agree with what has been said so far. The domestic incidents ought to be treated separately from the Brexit negotiation position of the May government. So it's important to underline for us on the continent, be it in Brussels, Paris or Berlin, the negotiation partners would have preferred a stable government in either regard, be it a left, right or center government, which would ensure that whatever compromise would be reached with this respectable government would be ensured by parliamentarian backing in London. And as we see it currently, there seems to be, the election result seems to have led to the Conservative government, Conservative Party being, say, open on the one hand to compromises, while the other side seems to be against them.
Yeah. Mr. Cui here in Beijing, let me ask you, the latest number of the London fire, 79 people dead. 5 only of them could be identified. 74 still missing, but now proclaimed as dead already. Today, another van incident in London as terrorist attack, identified as a hung parliament over there, a unmentored, unorganized administration so far by Prime Minister May. So, what kind of political chaos are we talking about here?
Yes, I think, I share with the point from our two guests. That, indeed, now for Prime Minister and her government, indeed it's in a mess. And also, as Prime Minister May promised that she will try to get the UK out of the mess. But so far, unfortunately, if we look at this domestic affairs and in a mess still, and also on land, I mean, reason for this big fire in this apartment, and also still a very, very unclear prospect for this Brexit negotiation. I think every bad thing happened at one time. I think it's never, I mean, so worse for this UK politics.
Having said that, though, Professor Begg, will the negotiator coming from the UK side now representing the administration have any strong tools in hand and confidence at heart to negotiate with Brussels about Brexit?
Well, we have something of a paradox here, because the negotiating position for what Britain is trying to get was set out initially in Theresa May's speech from January, followed by what we call the white paper, which is the government's position on what it wanted to do. And that is essentially to leave the single market, single European market, to control immigration, to stop being subject to the European Court of Justice, and therefore to have a very different relationship with the EU compared to what we have at present. Now, what's happened as a result of the general election is that you now hear the voice of business of dissident members of Theresa May's cabinet and others saying, pause, let's think again. Maybe we should be looking for a closer relationship with the EU, which means that we still want to be inside the single market, certainly inside the customs union, and if the price that we have to pay for that is to stop the controls on immigration, then maybe we should let immigration go, let it happen as it has up to now, and instead concentrate on the market. Now, the other side of all of this is that people are now talking in London very much about a transitional deal, which could last several years, rather than a cut-off in 2 years' time, as you said in your introduction.
Right.
That's a new element in the discussion here.
Okay, let me go to you, Mr. Lochocki. There are two things. One is single market or not. The other is custom union or not. These are the two most important crucial issues hanging in front of the UK negotiation about Brexit. All of the latest development, Mr. Lochocki, what would that mean for these two important things?
Well, it's very important to emphasize what you just said. The customs union and the access to the common market is not the most important issue for all Europeans. It's the most important issue for Great Britain.
That's right.
For the EU 27, the most important thing is the freedom of movement, which basically means that the European Union partners want to make sure that their citizens will not be blocked or will not get denied access to Great Britain. Meaning the customs market and the single market access is intrinsically interwoven with the migration question. So that means, as we just heard beforehand, if Great Britain is pushed by business leaders to make sure that they have access to the customs union and to the market, this will mean that the other EU 27 countries will make sure that the control of migration, as Theresa May is envisioning it, will not be capable of materializing.
Right. At this point, Mr. Cui, we understand there's one EU country that's really bordering the UK, that is the Ireland. So probably the negotiation will center on citizens living in each other's territory, Ireland and the UK, border arrangements between Ireland and the United Kingdom, and the amount that Britain stands to pay to get out of its previous commitment. What about that? From this specific focus to the bigger picture of the overall Brexit negotiation, your vision here?
Yes, as we know, it's always a question for this arrangement for North Ireland and Ireland Republic, because as we know, as a condition for this settlement of the North Ireland issue, that this freedom of movement between this North Ireland and Ireland is a very, very critical issue for UK. But at this moment, as we know, that it looks like UK want to get some more rights in a single market or custom union. But I think as the precondition from the European Union side, certainly this immigration or this free of movement will be a very, very important one. But now, as we know, another issue get this Ireland issue more complicated, because as we know now, the Conservative Party want to get coalition with the DUP from North Ireland. As we know, it also give a very, very big question mark for its future for its North Ireland issue because of the involvement of the DUP.
Now here is the thing, Professor Begg. Is there going to be a possibility of what you call the cliff edge, which is no agreement, at least for the very short term? And what would that mean even further to the May administration and for the domestic politics that you've got in your country, Professor Begg?
I think that Theresa May's statements that no deal was better than a bad deal is already history, just as she is likely to be quite soon. Instead, what we're seeing is what I mentioned earlier, the possibility of a quite extended transition lasting 3 or 4 years, because you have to separate two sets of negotiations. One is the separation, the divorce of the UK from the EU. And there, the three big items that Michel Barnier, the negotiator, has put as being the most important are what you've been discussing, the Irish border, the bill that Britain is expected to pay, which my best guess is that that's going to be of the order of 30 billion euros, not 100. And it'd be more or less what the UK is paying into the EU now over, let's say, a 4 or 5 year period. And the third big question is the rights of each other's nationals. Again, it's quite easy to settle that. And then we will move on to the future relationship, but only after these early things have been settled. It's quite important as well to note that the British Isles, which includes Ireland, are a separate free movement area from Schengen. You know, Wei, as a Chinese citizen, if you arrive with a Schengen visa, you can travel in several countries of the EU without showing your passport again. But you cannot get into the UK or to Ireland. And probably what they want to do is to preserve the British-Irish free movement area, try to avoid having a customs barrier, because that would be very damaging to the economy of both North and South of Ireland, and therefore stop anything that could threaten an entirely different matter, the Irish peace process.
But you know, having said all of this, Mr. Lochocki, here's the thing. I mean, with a weakened political stance that Prime Minister May now has, really, whether the EU negotiators will seriously discuss with her administration's representative is a big question mark. And secondly, even if these negotiations proceed as earlier planned, what if there's something wrong with her administration? Do everything have to start from scratch? Is there even a slight chance that maybe Brexit has to be renegotiated, both in the UK and beyond in other parts of the EU? Mr. Lochocki.
Well, I do think the Brexit position of the EU 27 countries is pretty solid, so I strongly doubt that anything could happen which would lead to an overhaul of the Brexit position of the European countries. However, it might as well be, as we just heard, that in the coming months or years the Theresa May government is readjusting her positions throughout the Brexit negotiations. However, these will not hamper or forestall the negotiations with the European Union partners, because as interested the European Union partners are to preserve the freedom of movement, they of course want to make sure that they have a stable divorce, you might say, and a stable new agreement which lies in the mutual interests of both London and Brussels. So I do think the stability of the May government is making the negotiations more difficult, in a sense that the European partners do not quite know what they really negotiate about. However, the negotiations as such, of course, will take place, and they will not be delayed further unless the British partners want to do so.
Yeah, but you know, Professor Begg, even the Austrian foreign minister said earlier when talking about Brexit, he said, we just don't know what the UK wants. We just don't know what they can do at this point. So is there a danger for your partners in the EU to waste all this time to negotiate with a representative of the May administration and eventually only find out another government coming into power, and therefore another overall streamline of the negotiation once again?
I think there are degrees of that. Some of the things that are on the table immediately would happen under any circumstances of Brexit. That's to say, the position of each other's nationals, the divorce bill, and the Irish border. What is for later in the process is redefining the economic relationship. Now, one extreme position, you mentioned Emmanuel Macron in your introduction, having said maybe the door is open to stay in the EU. In fact, there is a vacancy in British politics. I don't know if you're interested in applying, but the vacancy in British politics is for somebody who's going to articulate a pro-European Union stance. None of the parties in the last general election really did that, only one to a trivial extent. I do wonder sometimes whether now that Emmanuel Macron has won his battle in France, we could borrow him to reorder British politics for us.
That's a very interesting point. Mr. Cui, what about that possibility? Meanwhile, you see different politics played out in different countries in so different ways. In the UK, Brexit, and in France, it's a very different story. The parliament now, Macron's party, 1.5 year long, already become the majority. So it seems very different picture we're talking about here.
Yes, I think that undoubtedly French politics has a very different, tracks than the British politics. And also, still, I think there are some bigger and bigger influence from this European continental politics on UK politics. And also, at this moment, more and more British people, they have a question about that. Why don't we have a change like what happened in France? For example, how could this traditional political system, two-party system, Conservative Party and Labour Party, how could they do something to get some experience from this rise of centrist in French? And I think that another issue between the French politics and the British politics is undoubtedly the rise of President Macron And the weak Prime Minister Theresa May will give a very different, picture for the future of Brexit.
Right. You see two things going on all at the same time, Mr. Lochocki. On the one hand, this biggest ever negotiation between the UK and the EU about the so-called Brexit. On the other hand, the biggest change in politics on the European continent over the past few decades taking place in different national circumstances inside the UK, in France, and possibly near the future in Germany as well. How will these two interact with one another and further complicate and influence one another? It's an interesting thing. Mr. Lochocki.
Well, I wouldn't say that the current domestic political changes in the UK and in France, they might be remarkable in their own sake because they change the party political system. However, they do not quite change the rather traditional position. In Great Britain, you now have a Eurosceptic government, while in France, you have a very pro-European government. So neither national position is pretty new. And in Germany, you will have, regardless of how the election turns out, you will have a pro-European government, regardless of whether it be led by a center-left or a center-right.
Yeah.
So in fact, you have two very traditional fault lines. You have pro-European French, pro-European German, and Eurosceptic Brits. So you might say this is a very traditional configuration as we know it from after World War II. So in a sense, I do think what we currently see is we're gonna go back to an old, new normal.
All right, we'll see what that old new normal is like. Professor Begg, a final word from you. Agree with your colleague or not?
To some extent, yes. Although the uncertainty in Britain and the fact that we have a fragile government which is likely to collapse and maybe lead to new elections later in the year does introduce an element of new uncertainty. So there's an old new normal coming in here. Or to put it a different way, I don't know if you know the expression, a dog's breakfast. This is likely to be a dog's Brexit.